Hi, everyone. We're really excited to present to you for the first time this research that we've done together tonight. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. So I wanted to welcome everyone to the presentation. Christine already introduced us, so we can kind of skip over that part. I do want to mention that this entire systematic review is part of the Every Learner Everywhere network, which is an initiative funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So thanks to them, we were able to do this work. So what is Every Learner Everywhere? Every Learner is a group of networks and organizations that come together to use new technology to innovate teaching and learning with the goal of improving student outcomes for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students that are poverty affected and first generation and it's a group of partners and then secondary partners and tertiary partners and all sorts of people that have come together to kind of make all of this work happen, all funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it's really great network. And we've been doing a lot of work here. I apologize again, OLC Pets. Who are we? I'm gonna let Tanya introduce herself. So Tanya, take it away.
Hi, I'm Tanya Justin. I'm a senior scientist and the director of digital learning research development at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And as Christine mentioned, I'm also a board member for the Online Learning Consortium. I also head up the National Research Center for Distance Education and Technological Advancements that was originally a U.S. Department of Education FIPSE funded initiative of $1.48 million in 2014. But since, through private and foundation funding, we've been able to keep it going. And since that's such a mouthful, we like to just call it the Data Research Center.
And it's perfect too because of data, if you didn't catch on. And I'm Caitlin McCarthy. I am the Director of Grants Management and have worn quite a few hats at OLC over the last few years. I have been working with the Every Learner Everywhere network and other grant initiatives to do research and innovation. I am part of the innovations group. I manage the innovation work. Didn't switch on me, which is part of this particular project. So what is digital learning innovations for Every Learner Everywhere? How do we define it? Well, we are looking for trends and gaps in digital learning and adaptive technology. We want to identify ways to utilize and address those gaps and determine if they're scalable and how we can help make them scalable. So the first thing we did in venturing down this journey was to do an environmental scan of digital learning innovation trends. And that was published in January of this year. It was comprised of an analysis of the DLI award winners from 2016 to 2018, which were, if you're unfamiliar with the program, it was a Gates-funded initiative from a variety of organizations that applied for and proposed for digital innovations awards. They had many projects, went through a very strict and thorough review process, and then were awarded fairly significant contributions to promote those projects and to continue them. We had some really wonderful data. So DETA then took that and converted that into part of this particular report. We also did an environmental scan of digital learning peer-reviewed research and an environmental scan of popular media and organizations.
Yeah, and some of you might remember the OLC Digital Learning Innovation Awards. And so and a lot of them are highlighted within the trends report that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. And so these were either faculty-led or institutional-led submissions And, further, there were award winners, but it really identified cases at the faculty or institutional level across the country that were implementing different innovations in ways that actually impacted student outcomes. And we're also looking for ways to scale that across those innovations across their campus or across other institutions. And I see Patsy Moskal has joined us here. University of Central Florida was a winner of one of those Digital Learning Innovation Trends Awards.
So the findings of that report, the 2019 report, again published this January, came to what you can see right here. So there were 7 primary trends identified, 3 secondary trends, and then 22 honorable mentions. The number one finding, of course, was that there was more research needed really in every area. It was really surprising just how little there is in all of these areas that tie. So there's specific research that shows some reviews of different areas, but it doesn't really tie to student success or really improved learning, anything in that area in any way that we've been finding, or very little of it. Tanya can talk more about this.
Yeah, it was really interesting because we went through first, and all of these methodological approaches are sort of tying popular discourse with what we're seeing in the literature, which we all know that when we're talking about innovation, there tends to be a lot that people are talking about and doing and maybe even sharing here at conferences like OLC Accelerate. But a lot of times that hasn't made it to the literature yet. The research around it or around innovations may not have even been conducted yet. And when it is conducted, it may have not made it to the literature and to the peer-reviewed journals in a timely fashion. We also have the situation where sometimes things are being research-driven, different innovations that actually aren't having an impact in post-secondary education or in institutions of higher ed. And they're just really interesting for faculty and or researchers to be exploring. And they're doing it at a much more smaller scale than institutional-wide implementation. So for example, adaptive learning and OER were 2 trends that were very evident in the Digital Learning Innovation Awards. We hear lots in the media, in different news media organizations talking about these, and our different community groups at our conferences. Patsy Moskal and her colleagues just presented about adaptive learning on Monday morning, which was yesterday. It feels like a week ago, yesterday morning. So feel free to tap in and review their presentation. But exactly that, we were hearing a lot about adaptive learning and OER, but we weren't seeing a lot in the peer-reviewed journals, at least in the last year that we had looked. And then we see for topics that came up as trends like gamification and game-based learning and MOOCs, these are things that are not necessarily having an impact on student success in higher ed, but yet there's tons of research that's been done about these. People think gamification and game-based learning is really interesting and exciting. Obviously, MOOCs have tons of data. Big data that we can analyze using learning analytics to maybe tell us a little bit more about online learning behavior. Again, a lot of these things are not impacting on a broad scale post-secondary education. So that's just to give you an example of some of the things that we were pulling out. I should mention the journals, the peer-reviewed journals, as well as the documents that were pulled from the environmental scan from different popular media and community organizations. We use sort of a document analysis, a qualitative approach to analyzing those. And so we pulled out themes in the different articles as well as the documents, and we analyzed those themes in part to come up with the primary trends and the secondary trends as well as the honorable mentions.
So when we got to the honorable mentions, we ended up thinking, well, we're here as part of innovations, and looking at the trends isn't really necessarily innovative. Maybe exploring them in a deeper capacity is, so we decided to explore 2 of them in a deeper capacity this year. And then we decided to pick one of these other honorable mentions that was applicable to every learner everywhere and our own work. And where we really thought more improvement was needed in the field. And so we decided to choose equality, equity, and the achievement gap as our secondary trend to really hone in on.
And I should mention this trends report is slightly different because it wasn't just me and Kate sitting, in a basement like, hey, what are the trends? What are we feeling? This was actually based on empirical research that was conducted. There were several researchers that were involved, and data collection through gathering of documents, either through the peer-reviewed literature, through pre-identified journals, and or through online, access to different popular news and media or community organizations that are working sort of in the innovation space. And then it was through the analysis of those that we sort of came up with these. So I know, some of these honorable mentions, people are like, oh no, you've got to be kidding me. Blockchain is for sure a trend, which I always laugh. And so because, there's lots of things that we think are trends, but actually there isn't a lot of work being done in them, and there isn't a lot of research being done to identify where they're actually creating innovation and impacting student success in post-secondary education.
And so that's exactly what we did. So our step one was the environmental scan of digital learning innovations trends. And step two, we did the systematic review and environmental scan of digital learning at MSIs. So we got together and we decided what our objectives were. And we said, we thought that digital learning needs should be MSIs, including HBCUs and also community colleges, because community colleges also address the populations of adult learners and some of the first generation students. And they may not be specific to a specific type of institution, but they often have a lot of students that are in the racially minoritized populations that we're hoping to find successes for. And we wanted to determine support needs for faculty, student, and administration, IT, course development, and instructional design. So through our research, we wanted to see what sort of needs we could find and determine pathways to success in relation to digital learning.
At the end of the day here, we sort of were thinking that the MSIs, the minority serving institutions, historically, the first MSIs that were created were HBCUs. And so the idea was that by looking at organizations who are doing research on digital learning, MSIs, HBCUs, and community colleges who serve predominantly or were created with the purpose of serving this group of students, that we would be able to better identify factors that influence student success, understand how those interventions or practices were implemented, and understand the different stakeholder groups and how they could be better served with resources or support, and thinking about, creating a model of what sorts of things do we need to be doing nationally in post-secondary education to ensure that we are serving racial minoritized communities of students. And so that was sort of, the idea here, and why we had specifically established the context of MSIs, HBCUs, and community colleges, because, predominantly nationally, they were created to serve this population of interest.
Yeah. So we decided we had to define what an MSI was.
Yeah, I wanted to do that just for everyone in the audience as well. I think sometimes we are not clear, depending on where you're regionally located, on what is an MSI. And so there's actually, this is through federal legislation and federal programs that these definitions and the different institutions are sort of defined, and it also trickles into how they receive federal funding. But I thought it was really interesting because I did not know about all of the institutions. Where I'm from in my region, we do know about MSIs. We do not have HBCUs. We do know about tribal colleges because we do have a couple here, and we do have some HSIs. But it was really interesting. And some of the things we've encountered in our research is trying to come up with coding systems based on the student information system data and IPEDS data that we get from different institutions for us to actually code what is a minority and what's not a minority. So I think for some of the researchers in the room and or just folks who might be in regions that don't have these sorts of institutions, and you can find a complete listing online, just to understand the different sorts of institutions that we're talking about. There's a lot of institutions that were created and or specifically serve a majority of minority students.
And we also, for you, wanted to define what we meant by student success.
Yeah, I think student success has sort of become this sort of PR term. You know, I think a few years ago, everyone's like, yes, we're focusing on student success. And it was like, yes, because your enrollments are down because there's less 18-year-olds. And so higher ed is no longer about weeding out students, right? We need to retain all of our students for financial viability. You know, and I hope that's not only the economic or fiscal reasons that we're choosing to focus on student success, that we truly believe in the public value of education. And so at DETA, we had identified, which you can find in the data research toolkit, the different outcome variables that we look at. One of them is around learning effectiveness, which ties into student success. So through our research nationally, through the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education, as well as the What Works Clearinghouse, which is part of the IES, the Institute of Educational Sciences, we were able to come up with this definition. More or less, at the end of the day, when we talk about student success, we're actually talking about identifying factors that specifically show an impact on student outcomes. So we're talking about course completion, we're talking about grades, we're talking about attrition, you know, or course completion. It depends on where you're at and how you're defining that. But we're also talking about persistence, and grades are often called, by the way, academic achievement. But also we're talking about persistence through their program, meaning re-enrolling in, and obviously the end goal for most people is college graduation. All right, so I'm going to talk to you sort of about the details of the study and the methodology here. And so I wanted this time, when we decided to do this exploration into minority serving institutions, I wanted to actually do something a little bit more systematic. Previously, it was a little bit more of an exploratory study, although this is as well, but we wanted to make it more systematic this time. So we actually implemented the PRISMA-P protocol, which is a protocol used for systematic reviews of literature. However, as you know, this is not just a systematic review of literature because of innovations in the nature of themselves. We didn't just want to look at the peer-reviewed literature. We also wanted to do an environmental scan, which, by the way, environmental scan is sort of a business word to see like what's all out there. But more or less, we wanted to also analyze the public discourse that we were seeing with different news and media, as well as key organizations in the innovation space. But specifically, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about our protocol for those of you that were interested. So for study designs, we looked at different study designs. We didn't, this was not just experimental designs at all. So we, as part of our inclusion strategy, we used experimental studies were included, as well as survey studies or inferential studies. And we actually included mixed method studies and qualitative studies as well, as long as they showed an impact on student outcomes or student success. So just something to keep in mind. So there were predictive studies and descriptive studies. Well, I say all of this, but as you'll see, there were not a lot of studies. But these were all of the sorts of things that we wanted to include. We wanted to make sure, though, not to isolate just random control studies or experimental studies, that we want it to be more inclusive. And we understand that there are other types of research designs that can help us understand the relationship between digital learning and the variables that surround it and the impact on student outcomes. The population of interest, as you've heard us say, is that we were looking at post-secondary undergraduate education in the United States, which did lead to the exclusion of a couple research studies, and I'll talk about that. But at the end of the day, the Every Learner Everywhere Network is looking to identify factors that influence student success so that they can implement and scale those across the country, to help close the achievement gap, more or less. The interventions were not limited, but they had to relate to digital learning. So that also is something that's somewhat unique. There are lots of interventions that we see at MSIs, but few of them relate specifically to digital learning. And I'll talk about that too in a bit. The outcomes were all of the outcomes we just discussed in student success. The timing was we did 3 years, so 2017 to date, and date at the time was this August and September. I think this one was specifically September 2020. So from January 1st, and we have multiple studies running right now, but January 1st, 2017 to September of 2020. All right, the setting was obviously, we already discussed here, was MSIs, and we'll talk a little bit about how that expanded. And language were studies that were published in English. And so these criteria I share with you in case you want to replicate the same studies. I think these are, these topics that are of interest to us, especially with our movement towards equity and Black lives, that we need to ensure that we are doing these studies on an annual basis. So I share this with you and can share any other details with any of you all if you'd like to replicate these studies in the coming months or in the coming years. So the more effort we can have at these and replicating research, I think the better off we'll be. We do have a problem in general in this space that we don't do a lot of replication of research. But anyways, the three-tiered source strategy is DETA. We have a priority list of journals that we've identified that tend to publish research specific to digital learning and post-secondary institutions. Also, we have a second tier of resources, which are ones that have been identified by the category system as those relating to digital learning, online blended ed technology, and those sorts of areas. And then the third tier was just anything that we could find out there that related, and you'll find a little bit more about that. The search strategy and the keywords are quite extensive. And so we had several tiers of keywords. So the keywords weren't just digital learning and minority serving institutions. They were pretty much every word that you can think of that would describe that context or digital learning. So for example, we used blended and hybrid, technology in general as a term, educational technology, and so forth. And we expanded from MSIs to the other MSIs that we talked about, the categorization of them. So we also search for words like HBCUs, or it written out and the acronym, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges, Asian American and Pacific Islander serving. We also had keyword search around community college, technical college, trade college, versions of digital education, online learning. You guys get the point. There's a whole lot of different words that I can share with you if you're interested. There's a reason I'm going through the depth of this, because I'm going to share something with you that wasn't overly shocking based on my previous research in this area, but is a little disheartening. For article storage, we pull the articles in Google Drive and have an extraction, and they're also housed in our data research annotation database. They haven't been transferred there yet, but they will be. So you guys will all be able to access the annotations of the articles. So using the Purdue OWL annotation guidelines, we annotate all of the articles and use that in our analysis to expedite the process. And the study selection process must meet all of the criteria. However, we have a team of researchers that come together that discuss each study and whether it should stay in or not as well. And like I said, at the end, some of the studies outside of the protocol were deleted and some of them stayed in. All right, next slide. And here's just an example of what we pulled from our research. Yes, what you are seeing in front of you is only 7 studies out of 3 years of 18 journals and 6 databases. This is all that we found that pretty much focused on MSIs, including all of the categories of MSIs, or was a system level study that included an MSI or community college system or community college. So that's sort of why I went through a little bit detail there, is it's really disheartening to see that this is the only research from the last 3 years that we have that identifies digital learning interventions or variables or interventions related to digital learning that showed an impact on student outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about the themes around our findings. Next slide. And so because we only found 7 studies, we decided to expand the search strategy and keywords to anything related to ethnic or racial minorities. So we decided to not just look at minority serving institutions, or I should say look beyond minority serving institutions to find what other research could we find from the last 3 years, peer-reviewed research. And I should mention, at first we were just going to look at a group of journals that we felt were a priority, and then we had to go deeper, and then we were diving into databases because the lack of research that is published in this area, which, you know, brings us back to the fact that Black Lives Matters, and we need to be doing more research about the Black lives in higher education to ensure that we do have the right factors implemented instructionally and institutionally to impact student outcomes, because that's not what we were seeing so far in the process. All right, next page. So once we just started looking for any research that was specific to a sample and or population of interest, which was ethnic or racial minorities or racially minoritized, we came up with an additional 10 studies. Now, I should also mention that 3 of these studies are either by DETA, myself and my team, and or were funded through DETA, which is very interesting. And so these were studies that we found. You can go ahead and click to the next page. We will share all of this information with you, and it'll be on my slide share, and there will be a report coming. Kate will talk about that. But I just wanted you guys all to have a visual of what, what sort of disparity we have here in the research to guide us, and how even to create more equitable spaces and experiences for Black students and for other racial minoritized students in our post-secondary institutions. All right, next slide. So like I mentioned, we developed annotations of those studies. Majority of those studies were quantitative, 14 of them. That included not just experimental studies. And I say this because there are databases out there or systematic reviews that will only look at experimental studies. And we really wanted to expand that to other methodologies that we know that are just as effective in identifying the relationship or clarifying the relationship between these factors and outcomes. 2 of the studies were mixed methods, which is one of my favorites. So you can guess where those mixed methods studies came. I saw Nicole's message about mixed methods. And then one of the study was qualitative that we included as well. And so the factors that we identified by analysis of the annotations are on the screen in front of you. By just analyzing the MSI factors, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, content access intervention. So an intervention at the institution or at the system level in order to improve access to content, otherwise known as open education resources. There were a few studies, and again, remember, we only have 7 studies for MSIs. And I think there were 3 studies off the top of my head that were specific to OER. So we had a study of OER at the CUNY, at a CUNY University, at a Utah Community College group, and at Virginia Community College system. So OER is popular, as we know that there's been state and federal resources available for OER implementation. What we saw through that, just to give you a little bit more detail about OER is one of the themes, but also the predominantly we're seeing is that OER provides access to the content. We are seeing that students like it, they're satisfied with it. And we did see some impact on other student outcomes like grades and so forth. But for the most part, we're not seeing innovative uses or how we can actually use OER in new ways and or create OER to change the learning experience and necessarily have a positive effect on outcomes. So, and we have another study that's going on where we talk about OER. It's a study similar to this, but on the other trend of OER, where we get into that in a little bit more detail. And if you want to join us next week, Wednesday morning, super early in the morning, we'll talk about that one. The other one, which was a little disappointing, and I'll tell you why, was the course enrollment behavior. So a couple of the studies, and I always call it sort of the low-hanging fruit, pulled data from the student information system and just looked at course enrollment behavior. So is it, was it the course load that impacted the outcomes in face-to-face versus blended versus online courses? Was it the type of course, entry level versus major level, those sorts of things. So the course enrollment studies are easy because you're just pulling SIS data and analyzing it, but you're not necessarily, oh, I'm getting wordy here. I'm so excited about this. But you're not necessarily helping identify anything beyond advising for students. And so I'm always more interested in the instructional and pedagogical stuff. So that doesn't really help us with sort of what's in the box, but it does help us with advising. So we had a couple studies on that. We did have one around student readiness intervention. And so that one was really popular as well in the other studies that we looked at. So are our students ready for online? Do they have the tech skills they need? Do they know how to learn using technology, blended or online? Those sorts of things. Also that comes around tech access too was a theme. So studies around do students have technology access and or do they have the skills? And the final factor we saw was around course design. So as I mentioned in the course enrollment behaviors, they were specific to online enrollments. So there was a little bit about that. But what we are seeing not only in the MSI factors, but the other factors is some specifics around blended being particularly helpful to racially minoritized students. Now, when we move to the other studies, so the other 10 studies that were specific to a sample or participants that were ethnic or racial minorities, again, we saw ideas around student readiness impacting student outcomes and or interventions to help prepare students. And this wasn't always or just with technology access and technology or digital literacy. This was also with other things like academic preparedness and so forth. We did see a few studies, including the data funded study and data study that, as well as some others, the qualitative study that really focus on the interactivity aspect of it. So we saw that engagement can improve outcomes in online learning for racial minoritized students. We also saw in qualitative that students want more interaction with their faculty members as well as each other. We know that students have a higher, when I'm talking about students in general, I'm talking about racially minoritized students, that they have a greater need for socialization. They appreciate collaboration, in particular in small groups, because in the larger classroom settings, they sometimes feel marginalized. And they're also looking for supportive climates, which they sometimes feel that online courses offer that for them, sort of an equalization effect or democratizing effect more than they feel in the face-to-face classes where they're seldom called on. We also, again, as I mentioned, saw positive factors in blended instruction in technical education, as well as in entry-level classes in STEM. And again, the data research, which was actually published in the Online Learning Journal last November, looking at course design and other factors that positively impact student outcomes. And then again, we saw a theme around technology access. In particular, when you're offering OER, it was a barrier. Next slide. I know Christine's going to cut me off soon. So I'm just going to run through these really quick. Readiness is a really important issue. And I don't say this just because DETA has a recently published article that you can find in the American Journal of Distance Education around readiness, and a new one coming out in the study of higher ed. soon, but also just because right now, it's in particular in the pandemic, we are creating a greater digital divide that we didn't know that we necessarily had in online learning. And that students, it's not only that they don't have the tech access or the environment, they might not have the skill set that's needed to communicate online with each other or with their instructors. And also there's characteristics that are needed about around self-regulation and so forth. Also ensuring that they're academically ready through things like adaptive learning technologies. Next slide. Sorry, Kate's driving, so I'm like, one of the studies looked at adaptive learning as a chemistry prep in a summer online course and showed great impact for students. Next slide. I'll just run through these really quick. As we mentioned before, open education resources we saw in numerous studies were implemented not only to provide access, but we saw students liked them more. They felt it gave them more agency. And we're just on the cusp of seeing what we can actually do with OER to have a more positive effect on student outcomes. And then we all love course design, right? So course design we're seeing matters. For example, in the biology entry-level course, they wanted a more structured course and they wanted it to be blended. I love blended. About 3 of the studies specifically talked about blended learning experiences that led to a positive impact on student outcomes. The data study, again, focuses on student interaction with content, each other, the teacher, learning support and assessment, and how those design factors positively impact student outcomes, but in particular, they do that for all students, including racial minoritized students. And then blended learning, as I already mentioned, but here it is again. And my dear friend Tony Picciano and some other colleagues developed this way back in the day when OLC, previously Sloan C, was making blended learning happen. And it's coming back. We will have some more blended resources as well coming in the future. And just real quick, in the environmental scan, it very much complemented what we found. So we found information around course design, around OER, not much, and a lot around support resources. So sometimes we're not changing the system, we're not changing what's happening in the class, we're not changing the course design, we're not changing our institutional sort of approach to ensuring equality. We're just providing a lot of support resources, and I think they're important, but I think there's lots of other systemic, Kate and I were just talking about that. There's systemic changes that we need to be making, and I just mentioned this when I was on a panel at WCET, to ensure that we are providing learning experiences that work for Black students and other racial minoritized students as well. But the MSI findings, there were only 5 articles in the last year that have specifically talked about minority serving institutions. It was around benefits, meeting students where they are, pathways to degrees and other employment experiences, as well as the lack of funding. And if we can move to the next slide, my dear colleague, Lindsay Harness, who's a data senior researcher and also a professor at an MSI here in Milwaukee, had this really great quote, not that it was supposed to be attributed to her, but it was part of our findings write-up, but I just wanted to share it all with you because I think this is really important moving forward to ensure that we're creating equitable and exclusive experiences for our students, in particular our Black students, and MSIs are leading the way with that. And so there you go with that.
All right. She blew through those. So what's next? Well, we are going to do through OLC and in partnership with Every Learner Everywhere, an ideate, which is going to be focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion the week of December 7th. So please join us. It's open and free for all. We want to, Tanya, talk a little bit about how you're going to kind of play into this too.
Yeah, so just really quick, I think the registration will be open later this week. And so we're looking at it as an opportunity because for me, I was very disappointed that there isn't more research out there, because right now we should be implementing practices in our classrooms and, oh, I like how my computer's dying. In the classroom, as well as, emergency plug-in. Okay, in our classrooms, as well as at our institutions, to really not just say Black Lives Matter, we're anti-racist, but to be making it happen right now. And so we're looking at this as an opportunity to generate practices and identify practices and help scale those through the discussions that will be happening at this event. So please make sure to sign up and join us, and so that we can share and learn more about what we're doing in the classroom and at our institutions.
Yeah. And we're excited. We're excited about this. A little disheartened about finding so little research, but hopeful that we'll be able to propel the research going forward into the future.
Absolutely.
And the good work.